May it please the Court. Your Honor, my partner, Chris Alfaro, and I, Jacob Shaw, represent the International Criminal Court in the case of ICC versus Joseph Stalin. We're here today to seek to charge that Stalin did commit acts against humanity and genocide through his actions as a leader of the USSR and his handling of the Holodomor. Our partner will address points concerning documentary evidence of these events, and I will lay the framework of why these crimes reach the level of genocide and crimes against humanity. Our legal framework, the definition of genocide. According to Article 2 of the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, genocide is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, or racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The actus reus and the mens rea. It is clear from the definition and from international law in this area that the crime must involve the actus reus, or the physical aspect of undertaking the deeds, and the mens rea, that's to say the mental element of the crime. It should be noted that it is not the motivation, that's to say the reason why, that is important in the mens reas of this crime. Further, not only the general intent to destroy that matters, it is a specific intent to destroy the targeted group as a group that is the key. Furthermore, as has been pointed out in a recent case reviewing the events in Bosnia, viewed under the microscope of the Genocide Convention, the mere fact that civil war or upheaval took place did not lift the events to the level of genocide. Although the existence of evil, civil war, or upheaval was a factor that could raise actions to the point where they became genocidal. The key thing is that the specific intent to destroy the targeted group was at some point in time, even if it is not only for a split second, coincide with the actus reus. The coincidence of the two elements, the physical act and the mental intention, triggers the characterization of these events as genocide. The intent. It is an axiomatic fact of international law that intent, since it is in the mental ingredient, cannot ever be proven directly. Nobody can look into someone else's mind to determine what their intent was. As a result, one must determine the specific intent in this area in one of two ways. Either the offending party must confess a specific intent, or a specific intent must be found by inference from the circumstances in which the events took place. The determined intent was shown by clear and convincing evidence that specific intent to destroy the targeted group was in fact present when the acts leading to the destruction took place. Each of the elements of the offense must be proven by clear and convincing evidence to establish the offense. Now, the four basic elements. The definition of genocide as it stands today is based on four constituent parts: a criminal act with the intention of destroying, a national, ethnic, or religious group targeted as such. This then is the legal framework through which we must examine the events in Ukraine in 1932 to 33, whether indeed genocide took place. Let us consider each of these elements in turn. Firstly, a criminal act, the actus reus. As Stanislav Kolchitsky argued, the mechanism Stalin and the Communist Party of USSR employed to deal with the Ukrainian countryside while it was in revolt lifted the events in Ukraine out of the category of merely a famine and into the realm of genocide. To him, the essence of the genocide was the requisitioning system employed by the Kremlin leadership. In the fall of 1932, on orders from Moscow, government troops came to villages requisitioning grains to meet Stalin's quotas. At gunpoint, they took away grain, even when peasants did not have enough to feed themselves. Those peasants who had no grain were deprived of any other food stocks they had, including garden vegetables and cattle. Those that resisted were shot. When this policy of requisitioning grains at gunpoint was further enforced by sealing off borders and thereby preventing the escape of the famished peasants, the result was genocide. According to Ukraine President Viktor Yushchenko and others, 10 million people died in the Ukrainian Holodomor of 1932 to 33. Some express doubts about whether the magnitude of this number is true, though not about the genocide itself. Making such estimates is no exact science, particularly since the Communist Party of the USSR did everything it could to hide what was done. But even when considering the most conservative estimates, such as those of the Kolchitsky, who estimates 3.5 million people perished in Ukraine, one has to add the 3 million Ukrainians who also perished outside Ukraine in places like Kuban, the North Caucasus, Russia, and Kazakhstan, where there were heavy populations of Ukrainians as well. The number of genocide victims outside Ukraine is estimated in the previously mentioned International Commission report, as well as an article recently written by New York attorney and president of the Ukrainian World Congress, Askoy Lashinsky. Their method was to review the national statistics from the two Soviet censuses pre- and post-famine 1932 to 33. To reach the conclusion that in addition to the victims in Ukraine, 3 million died outside Ukraine, but within the orbit of the Soviet Union. So numbers of 7 to 10 million Ukrainians appears to be not far from that mark, at least according to most commentators. These statistics were recognized in November 7, 2003 statement signed by 25 United Nations member countries, issued at the 58th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and transmitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations by the permanent mission of Ukraine to the UN. That statement read in part, "In the former Soviet Union, millions of men, women, and children fell victims to the cruel actions and policies of the totalitarian regime. The Great Famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine, or Holodomor, which took from 7 million to 10 million innocent lives and became a national tragedy for Ukrainian people. In this regard, we note the activities in observance of the 70th anniversary of this famine, in particular organized by the government of Ukraine. Subsequently, 14 more UN member countries signed a statement directly or sent letters of support. Given the broad range of acknowledgement of the physical acts, no matter what the final number of victims was, the actus reus quite clearly has been established. It is the mens rea, the intent to destroy, must address more carefully. Secondly, intent to destroy. As already mentioned, in examining genocide, we must concern ourselves with two kinds of intent, general intent and specific intent. At this stage, we are concerned with the general intent to destroy. We have the issue of specific intent, that is to say, the matter of targeting a specific group, so discussion below under the fourth element in the definition. In looking at the issue of the intent to destroy, it is helpful to recall the legal concepts of misfeasance and nonfeasance, to distinguish between general intent and specific intent. Did the events of 1932 to 33 amount to what legally is understood as misfeasance, that is to say, that the Soviet leadership in the Kremlin act purposefully to create the famine? Or were the events merely nonfeasance? That is to say, even though the Soviet leadership may have known what was unfolding, but not bothered to act upon prevention of starvation. Proof of nonfeasance neglect would be sufficient to meet the requirement of proving intent to destroy, but would not be insufficient to meet the higher standards of misfeasance action. In addition to the UN statement, there are a host of other authorities that establish that the Kremlin leadership in 32 to 33 has a requisite general intent as set out in the convention. Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, the final congressional report of the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine famine and findings of an international commission of eminent international jurists convened by the Ukrainian World Congress, which rendered its final report in 1990, all concluded that the requisite intent to destroy was present. Thirdly, a national, ethnic, or religious group. Since Ukrainians speak a separate language, have their own distinct culture, tradition, and common 1,000-plus year history, as well as worship in Ukrainian Unite or Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox churches, it will be very difficult for anyone to maintain that they were not a national or ethnic group in 1933. Even Soviet sources recognize the distinctiveness of the Ukrainian language and culture. No serious historian or legal commentator disputes this element. Anyone who has any doubt on this point should direct their questions to the government of Ukraine or such institutions as the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute or the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. Fourthly, targeted as such. This fourth element that is critical to establish the misfeasance on part of the Soviet Union. Leadership and the necessary specific intent to target Ukrainians as a group. Was the famine in Ukraine and other regions of the Soviet Union heavily populated by Ukrainians? The accidental result of collectivization of the peasantry and the industrialization of the USSR, or were those who perished victims of intentional genocide targeted as the Ukrainian people? Confessions or admissions against interest. As discussed previously, one means of establishing specific intent is to obtain a confession or a statement against interest. And in the law of evidence, it's considered reliable since the declarant makes a statement in circumstances unfavorable to him or her. In the case of Ukrainian genocide, there are some passages that point in this direction. Ukrainian peasantry, who were 80% of the population of Ukraine, were always a force to contend with for Stalin. And considering the struggle of the Ukrainian people for statehood and independence, the role of peasants in regard to Stalin in his article, Marxism and National Colonial Question, wrote, "Farmers present themselves the basic force of the national movement. Without farmers, there can be no strong national movement." This is what we mean when we say the national question is actually the farmers' question. Now, this is a critical point in considering the issue of specific intent on the part of the leadership of the former USSR. It discloses that Stalin knew that his efforts to collectivize Ukraine and remove supposed rich kulaks and other resistors were at the same time really dealing with the national question and a matter of the Ukrainian nation whose survival was ultimately threatened the continued existence of the Soviet Union. Stalin's intent in pursuing a politically orchestrated famine was to destroy the Ukrainian village, its infrastructure, and farmers, since he knew that by destroying these, he would have, for the most part, destroyed the political aspirations of the Ukrainian nation. For him, the class struggle is fused with national struggle, at least in pronouncements. A careful analysis of what Stalin and the Communist Party of USSR did reveals that under the guise of a crackdown or kulak opportunists wreaking havoc on Soviet efforts to industrialize not only the Ukrainian village, but also the Ukrainian cultural leadership of that time, including figures like writer Osip Vinchini, and in fact the entire Ukrainian intelligentsia, were targeted for liquidation. In reality, this anti-Ukrainianism went far beyond class warfare, since it decimated millions of Ukrainians regardless of their class in Ukraine or elsewhere. According to Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War, when he visited Stalin at the Kremlin in August 1942, he asked, "Have the stresses of war been as bad as you personally as carrying through the policy of the collective forms?" "Oh no," Stalin said. "The collective form policy was a terrible struggle, 10 millions." He said, holding up his hand, "It was fearful. For years it lasted." Stalin went on to say that apart from minority that were exiled, the vast majority perished. Thus, Stalin's equation of formers was a national question in Ukraine, where 80% of the population was peasantry, and his admission to Churchill of losing 10 million to the collectivization of forms are both statements made against interest and therefore reliable as evidence pointing towards guilt. Taken alone, they may not be enough, but when added to the evidence that follows, they assist in establishing the case. Clearly, a man-made famine, genocide, raged through Ukraine, the ethnic Ukrainian region of northern Caucasus, such as Kuban, and lower Volga River region in 1932-33. This resulted in the death between 7 million to 10 million people, mainly Ukrainians. This was instigated by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his henchman Lazar Kagabich. The main goal of this artificial famine genocide was to break the spirit of Ukrainian former peasants and to force them into collectivization, and he was using the faith of tool to break the renaissance of Ukrainian culture that was occurring under approval of the communist government in Ukraine. Moscow perceived this as a threat to the Russo-centric Soviet rule and therefore acted to crush its cultural resistant renaissance. Acted to crush this cultural renaissance in the most brutal, sadistic manner. The resulting goal of this artificial genocide was to ethnically cleanse Ukrainians from vast territories. And in spring of 1933, the rural population of Ukraine was dying at a rate of 25,000 a day, half of them children. The land that was known worldwide as the breadbasket of Europe was being ravaged by a man-made famine of unprecedented scale. It was engineered by Stalin and his henchmen to teach Ukrainians independent formers, and I quote, "a lesson they would not forget," for resisting collectivization, which meant giving up their land and livestock to the state. Ukraine was then under Soviet domination. Moreover, it was meant to deal a crushing blow to any national aspirations of the Ukrainian people, 80% of whom were formers, peasant formers. While millions of men, women, and children in Ukraine and in mostly ethnically areas of Ukraine, northern Caucasus, were dying, the Soviet Union was denying the famine and exporting grain from Ukraine to have fed the entire population. This indeed reaches the level of genocide and crimes against humanity. Therefore, Your Honor, we pray that you vote to convict Joseph Stalin on the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity for his actions against the Ukrainian people in 1932 and 1933. Thank you for your time.
May it please the Court, Your Honor. Please cross-apply all of my partner Jacob Shaw's arguments and allow me to expand on the evidence in each of these cases. Subsection B, documentary evidence of genocide. According to the Ukrainian professor Yuri Shapoval, Stalin's concern with Ukraine was clearly stated to Lazar Gnagnevich in Stalin's letter of September 11, 1932, in which he states, "At this point, the question of Ukraine is the most important. The situation in Ukraine is very bad. If we don't take steps now to improve the situation, we may lose Ukraine. The objective should be to transform Ukraine in the shortest period of time into a real fortress of the USSR." At a November 1933 meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Pavel Pashchev, who was sent to Ukraine and given dictatorial powers to implement Stalin's policies, there reported, and I quote, "Under the direct leadership and direction of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and personally of Commander Stalin, we smashed the Ukrainian nationalist counter-revolution." In the same report, Pashchev says nothing about their success in grain procurement or the collectivization of the peasantry, but instead reports with pride about the victory over the Ukrainian people. According to Professor Roman Servin of the University of Montreal, two other documents which recently came to light further reveal that Stalin's extermination policy was directed specifically against the Ukrainian people. On 14th December 1932, a joint resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR condemned the process of Ukrainization. Until this resolution, Ukrainization had been carried out in Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus, especially Kuban. This process grew up in the 1920s, and by the 1930s had taken root throughout Ukraine. According to the document, Ukrainization established Pelutris, followers of Simon Pelutra, the head of the former independent Ukrainian National Republic, that was smashed by the Red Army in 1922. And Ukrainian Burgoy nationalists to infiltrate local administrations, educational establishments, and mass media outlets. The document claimed that these anti-Soviet elements created counter-revolutionary cells, pursued a policy of sabotage and destabilization, and were responsible for the problem of state procurement in these regions. The resolution also discloses that the solutions ordered by the party or the state hierarchy, namely to put Ukrainization in Ukraine on its original track, to assimilate the Ukrainian people into the Soviet system. Pelutris and Ukrainian Burgoy nationalists were to be removed from Soviet institutions in Ukraine and punished. Among other